These next 2 videos will just be covering one aspect of our engine rebuild. But it's a pretty big one, and heavy. These are the rusty cylinder heads from our $200 454. It's going to be a lot of work to get them into acceptable condition, so let's get started. The first thing we can do is use an impact to remove the coolant temperature sender. This one is busted and we won't be using it anyway, so we'll be tossing it. We also need to, before I forget, label the cylinder heads. In just a minute we'll be removing all of the valves, and we want to make sure they go back where they came from. And now that it'll be significantly more difficult to mix them up, we can start disassembly by loosening up the valve keepers. In the last rebuild series on this channel, we simply did this by hitting the end of the valve spring compressor while it was installed, which worked just fine, but in this video we'll be utilizing a slightly more traditional approach using a socket. I'm just placing the socket over the valve spring retainer and giving it a firm tap. This helps unseat the keepers from the retainer, making the whole assembly much easier to take apart. And once we've given all of those a good bounce, we'll break out the valve spring compressor. This is a very basic universal one that I had previously modified to use with the impact gun. It's certainly not the best in the world, but every time I've called upon it so far, it has gotten the job done. We'll give that a rat-a-tat-tat to compress the spring, remove the keepers, and then we can loosen it to remove the spring assembly. The lowermost part of this assembly is the valve spring rotator, but it seemed to be pretty stuck in place on the head, so we'll leave it there for now. More or less, things seemed to be going just fine until I realized that the valve was stuck. It did not want to move. We'll give the valve tip a quick pass with the file to make sure there isn't any burr on the edge that will make it even more difficult to get out of the guide. And then, well, we'll go straight for the mallet. This is not what you should have to do, and let me tell you, it does not feel good doing it. The valve was moving with a not incredibly substantial amount of force, but you really shouldn't have to break out the mallet to move it in the first place. I went ahead and tapped it back and forward a few times to help loosen it up, and eventually, with a twisting motion, managed to remove it from the guide. It shouldn't be particularly surprising from the rust in the cylinders, but these heads have some rust of their own. The moisture that had gotten into the engine has rusted the valve guides just a little bit as well. These guides are supposed to be a tight fit around the valve stems, so that very small amount of surface rust was enough to lock it in place. Hopefully they're not all that bad, although some of them certainly aren't looking promising. The valve itself looks decently good at least, and we'll set that into our organizer to keep track of it. Through the cleaning process, we will be mixing up the valve spring assemblies, but for now, in case there's something wrong and we need to track a problem down, we will keep them in order. That's only one, though, and there are a lot of valves left to remove, so let's get back to the cylinder head. For this next one, let's get an up-close look at this process. First, we'll put the threaded stud on the far end of the valve spring compressor up against the combustion face of the valve, and tighten down the stud on the other side with this round cage up against the valve spring retainer. And with that compressed, the keepers are loose, and we can remove them using a small magnet. Typically, one will come right out, and then just by moving the valve spring compressor around a little bit, you can release tension on the other and get it to stick to the magnet. Then all we have to do is loosen the spring compressor, and as we lift it off of the head, the spring assembly falls right out. Beneath that, on the valve stem is the umbrella seal, and these came off easily by hand. Just like the last one, the spring rotator is stuck in place, as is the valve. It doesn't look or feel like the valve tips on these are mushroomed, but just to be safe, we'll use the file again to make sure there's no burr on that outer edge or the keeper groove. Then out comes the mallet. This one gave up pretty easily, and we could finish removing it by hand. And now that we're well acquainted with the process, we can finish removing the rest of the valves from the cylinder head. We'll compress the spring, remove the keepers, release the compressor, remove the spring, cringe as we hammer out the valve, frown at the condition of the valve, and repeat this again and again. The exhaust valve we just removed was from rusty cylinder number 3, the worst of the bunch. And once we pop out the intake valve, we can see that it looks the same way. There's buildup and rust just raining off of it. For whatever it's worth, none of the other valves looked anywhere near as bad as that one. In fact, only one more, the rusty intake valve from cylinder number 7, needed assistance from the mallet to remove it. That valve was also fairly rusty and, I'd say, the second worst. It was a bit of an ordeal, but finally we have the bare cylinder head in front of us. And looking at it now, I'm kind of wishing I didn't. The situation in those runners is definitely worse than I had hoped. Check out all of the rust buildup that had been sitting on some of these valves. This is pretty nasty. That's iron from the cylinder heads and the valves just piled up, stuck around that edge. On the upside, Mother Nature decided to give us a free intake runner porting job, so that's something. The valves themselves are also looking a bit sorrowful and will need a lot of cleaning up. While the cylinder head is here on the bench, we can do a little bit more work, starting with removing the head gasket. That was still stuck in place, but all we really have to do is lift it off. Then we'll use our trusty razor blade scraper to start cleaning up that surface. We'll have to go and clean this all a couple more times, but it's good to start the process and at least get some of this junk off. With that looking 2% better, we'll call that good for now, and we can flip the cylinder head back up and remove all of the rotators that fell out onto the bench. I think it was actually just the oil film holding them in place. Now the cylinder head is completely disassembled, and we're ready to do the other one. The passenger side head has this, which I assume is a coolant temperature sensor for the computer. We will once again play the valve spring xylophone and then start disassembling the head. The process on this side proceeded in very much the same way, and 3 of the valves needed to be tapped out with the mallet. Visually, things weren't as rusty on this side, but clearly some of them were still a bit stuck. The only kind of interesting thing was that the keeper groove on the front intake valve had quite a burr on it. You can see that, unlike with the other stuck valves, this one moves freely in the cylinder head right up until that keeper groove. It's not uncommon to have this area mushroomed out a little bit from the force of the valve opening and closing on that spring so many times, but it did seem weird that it was only one valve out of 16 that had this issue. It took a fair amount of careful filing to get that ridge down so that the valve would pull smoothly out of the guide. With the head finally apart, we'll remove its head gasket and give it a light scraping, and this is what was left behind. Those formerly clean shop towels are stained with the crimes that were committed on these 2 cylinder heads. And much like the heads themselves, the valves are also looking a little bit worse for wear. They certainly could have been worse, a lot worse, really, but they're not good. Throughout this cleaning process, we'll be careful to keep the valves in order. As much as possible, we'll keep them in our organizer, and when they have to leave it, we'll keep them lined up in the same way. As far as the cleaning process itself, much like most of the other engine parts, we'll be doing it, for the most part, the hard way. I decided to do this in a few stages, the first of which being a gentle brushing to get any big chunks of carbon and rust off of the valves. After that, I decided to see what would happen if we soaked them in purple power. I didn't expect them to come out totally clean or anything, but I wanted to see what kind of effect it would have on the various types of buildup on the valves. We'll transplant each of them into this plastic bin, keeping the valves in line. We'll also drop in all of the valve springs, the rotators, the retainers, and the keepers. We'll then fill that container up with some of the admittedly pretty dirty purple power that we've been using to clean all of the other parts, and we'll set that aside, cover it, and let it sit for 12 hours. After that, we'll use the parts washer proper to clean up all of the small parts. The keepers themselves came out of this looking really good, and all I really did was shake them around in a paper towel to dry them off and wipe off anything that was left. The valves were definitely looking better, but not exactly pristine. I decided to give them all a brushing down in the parts washer to get a better look. We'll polish the valve stems with red Scotch-Brite, but the heads are going to need a more aggressive wire brushing. The valve springs, retainers, and rotators all got a hand cleaning as well. Soaking in the purple power did a great job at cleaning these up, and they really only needed a light brushing and a wipe down. I wanted to make sure to get all of that degreaser out of the rotators though, and to do so I decided to soak them in Marvel Mystery Oil. The rotators were feeling pretty crunchy after coming out of that bath, probably because I was using dirty degreaser. I'm sure regular motor oil or ATF or whatever else would do a fine job with this as well, but this will give them that sweet Marvel scent. These will stay in the jar until reassembly, and I'll just give it a shake every once in a while. All we'll do for the valve springs is give them a rinse off with brake cleaner, a spray down with WD-40, and then they'll all get packed away in a plastic bag. This is the same way that a lot of the small parts, like the bolts, were stored during this rebuild. But I can't exactly just pack the valves away because they need more work. The condition they're in varies quite a bit, but they're all going to need a thorough wire brushing. That's not all they're going to need, and if we take a close-up look at the valve faces, yeah, they're not so pretty. This exhaust valve actually doesn't look too unusual and is at least mostly flat. A little bit of valve lapping would most likely clean those up pretty well. On the other side of that, here's the number 3 intake valve. It's looking, well, pretty terrible. That face that's supposed to be a clean, sharp, straight edge is kinda looking more like a sea sponge. I am determined against all reason to reuse these parts, but that is a lot to clean up. Everything so far has really not done the trick, so we're actually going to have to do this the proper way. Well, at least my weird iteration of the proper way. The best and easiest way to clean these is with a wire wheel on a bench grinder, but I don't have one of those, so we're going to get a little creative. First, I'll wrap the valve tip with a bit of masking tape. That should help protect it from the jaws of the drill press chuck. And if we fire that up, you can kinda see what I'm getting at here. With that spinning, we'll apply the other part of the equation, which is this wire cup brush on the drill. Spinning the drill in the opposite direction seemed to be cleaning it up pretty well. I did learn a new way to drop a valve, but after tightening up the chuck a bit more and being more careful with the downward force, this setup seemed to work quite well. It's a bit more gentle and a little bit less grabby than a wire wheel on a bench grinder. The exhaust valves, with all that high heat buildup, were a bit harder to clean, and a more aggressive solution would probably have worked out better here. Some of the intake valves have their fair share of buildup too, mostly a result of burning oil. There was a lot of material to remove, but the process seemed to be doing an okay job judging by the clouds. We'll also give the valves a final polish with red Scotch-Brite, particularly on the valve stems. Since these were exposed to a lot and dragged through those rusted valve guides, it's a good idea to polish them up. After a few minutes, even that blackened intake valve came out looking pretty good. We'll repeat this process for all 16 valves, getting them down to bare metal as much as possible to get them ready to be lapped to the cylinder head seats. Just looking at the base of the drill press after we were finished, clearly those valves were pretty nasty. So they're shiny now, but what kind of actual condition are they in? It varies quite a lot, but a few of them have some fairly significant pitting. Once again, we're looking at cylinder number 3's intake valve since it is the worst of the bunch. There are craters on the valve stem, the fillet, and the face. These pockmarks on the fillet aren't really doing flow any favors, but I don't think they're going to have any significant effect. On all of the valves, the damage to the valve stems seems to stop at the base of the guides, which means that shouldn't do any substantial harm either. However, the ones on the face will keep it from sealing, and those are pretty terrible. We're going to go beyond lapping the valves into grinding territory, but that'll have to wait until we get back to them in the next episode.